Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us virtually for day two of our National Small Nonprofit Summit 2024. I'm excited to be here with you today, dive in to some of our topics across the day. But starting here with a follow up from yesterday's session on Executive Director Burnout Survey results, what we can take away from the data there, and how we can engage our staff during stressful times. Uh, if you have any questions and follow up, feel free to reach out to our team. I also apologize in advance. My video is lagging a little bit due to some Wi Fi issues today, but hopefully the sound and everything else still comes through good for y'all. So, as we kind of think about this topic, as we're kind of looking at diving into how to engage staff during stressful times, it's important we want to ground ourselves in the data that we shared yesterday. So yesterday we were talking a little bit about just a couple of highlights. And if you weren't at yesterday's session, no worries at all. It's completely standalone. You didn't have to be there. But if you were there, we'll refresh. If you weren't, a little bit of a highlight of what we talked about. Those recordings will also be available in the coming days on the Nonprofit Summit website. So you can definitely go check that out if you haven't already seen it. So we look at current data. This is a survey we did with a little over 170 executive directors, a little over 160 organizations represented, and 56% of executive directors, kind of as of today, are reporting that they either are burnt out, have recently been burnt out in the last kind of 2 to 3 months, or feel like they're about to experience burnout. They're right on the verge. They think that's coming up in the next month or two. This is, while still a negative stat there, right? That means one out of two executive directors are feeling this level of burnout. Obviously, not something we want to see in the space. We want that leadership to be more sustainable. This is better, though, than it was the last couple of years. So, looking on the bright side of the stat, this number is over 60%. It was in the mid 60s last year that we did this in 2022. And then it was a little over 70% when we did this for the first time back in 2021. So as we're thinking about, excuse me, this data, again, it's something that we're seeing the numbers get better, a real market improvement between 2021 and now. But we still see too high a rate, right, of leaders reporting that they're in that kind of critical burnout phase. The other thing we'll say with this is that this number is probably a little underreported, right? If you're really kind of currently experiencing burnout, you're probably not filling out a survey you get sent, right? So we actually probably have a little bit of bias there in the results. So this number might be a little bit higher. But regardless of that, that bias would have been there for the last couple of years as well. So we do see this getting better. It's still a long way to go in terms of kind of having a healthy and sustainable sector. Secondly, when we look at how leaders view their teams right now in terms of stress and burnout, this is a lot of what we'll talk about today for some of the tips and strategies that we discussed, is that about 46% of organizations feel like their team's burnout has kind of leveled off, right? So the stress and burnout they had last year is pretty consistent with the stress and burnout they're having this year. About 20% of organizations, so 1 out of 5, feel like it is worse this year. But a third of organizations actually think things are better. So overall, right, we're right around 80%, 4 out of 5, feel like things either aren't getting worse or actively getting better. So again, good numbers there for us to hear. The majority of teams are reporting that they're not burnt out, which again, not true a couple of years ago. So all that points to some really exciting progress. And then finally, why the improvement, especially for teams. One reason is that organizations are really investing in their staff right now. Over half of organizations in the past year alone have expanded the benefits that they offer their staff. Almost universal, 87% offer health insurance to their teams. 3 out of 4 offer retirement as well as professional development services. And just under that, offer more than 2 weeks of vacation annually, right, as kind of a minimum. So all of this to show, and as we look into other kind of benefits data that we discussed yesterday, the nonprofits are actually investing in their staff at a higher level than the for-profit counterparts. That's because we're leading with our values, right? As a sector, we're really diving into supporting the people making the change and doing the work. And we're also, critically understanding the need to retain the staff we have. We still see nonprofit turnover be around kind of 19% as the rate of kind of voluntarily leaving a role in the nonprofit sector. That is better than it has been, but still 7 percentage points higher than the overall sector average for kind of employee turnover. And it's significant enough that there's still shows a higher likelihood of turnover in the nonprofit space than all other sectors kind of combined. So it's important that we're continuing to think about employee engagement issue. So when we think about some of the tips or responses we'll talk about today, it's important we talk about kind of why burnout or why kind of stress, lower engagement is happening in the first place. This is not an exhaustive list. And also for every individual, this is going to be different. It's going to include some combination of these items and possibly many more things as well, right? But some of the biggest things we hear from our partners when talking to them, or talking to individual nonprofit staff about what's causing that disengagement to burnout somewhere on that kind of spectrum. These kind of 6 or 7 things come to the top. So the first is just, and this is probably the most common one we at least initially hear. There's others underneath the surface, but this is usually the first one that manifests itself, which is just that the volume of work is unsustainable, right? It's either too much work all the time, or it's high intensity that could be done for a couple of weeks, but it's done for a long time, right? Again, multiple times we've heard this phrase about sprinting a marathon, right? And nonprofit staff feeling like they're on that sprint, which if it was only for a couple of weeks would be, potentially okay for them. But they're on that sprint and there's no end in sight with the sprinting. So that level of intensity of volume, kind of week after week after week, big driver of this kind of disengagement burnout. Secondly, we see this less often in nonprofits than other sectors, but still happens a fair amount. Is that it's a negative management relationship, right? The employee has a negative relationship with their direct manager or other organizational leaders, and that negative relationship is causing them stress, right, and causing them to kind of disengage. Not feeling their work is seen or valued, right? So there's a lack of recognition, just that their work matters, right? That it's causing something positive to happen. It's important to the organization. That lack of recognition over time can lead to that disengagement and burnout. Similar to that, but a little different, that recognition is really from the organization, right? Fellow staff, manager, executive director, et cetera, are telling them, good job, you matter, your work matters. For impact, right? Similar but different, they can't see the results or difference their work is making. So that might be because they're in programming and they're just they're not kind of seeing the day-to-day impact though, because of the type of program we do, or it could be, we see this even more often, if they're working at a non-programmatic job at the organization, they don't necessarily see that difference every day. And as a field, right, that's often most motivated by that kind of human impact story, they're not getting those stories. It's hard to stay motivated. The last, this next to last one happens a little bit less, but we do see as we kind of have longer conversations with people, this often gets uncovered, is that there's no goals, right? So again, it makes us more likely to feel that sprinting a marathon if we don't know the marathon ends at a certain mile marker, right? It just feels like, hey, we're going, and then eventually someone might tell us to stop. That's a lot harder than knowing how far we have to run. So not having some clear goals, clear direction makes it feel like we could do anything, and also that we have to do everything. So it's really important we're having those goals. Those are kind of the bumper lanes and the bowling alley that kind of keep us on track. And then finally, this is more for kind of frontline staff, but the job itself may be causing, some trauma, secondhand trauma, stress, building up a lot of kind of personal things as well. And depending on the type of programmatic frontline work you do, that could be a real concern, a real challenge for some of your programmatic stuff. And then finally, underneath all these kind of work buckets and others that we could have listed there, is the personal as well, right? People, when they come to work in the morning, they're bringing their whole selves, right? Even if they don't feel like they can necessarily show up that way to their coworkers, if their organizational culture isn't something like that, they still, if they're tired from the night before because they're dealing with a sick family member, they're still going to be tired in that morning, right? We don't have the kind of shut off switch when we get to the office. Really thinking about developing those relationships with staff and the culture where folks feel like they can be open about that, right? So that we can know something's going on and hopefully kind of manage workload accordingly during that time and be accommodating for that. But these 7 we see are 7 of the more common causes of burnout and disengagement. We'll talk about some strategies to address and deal with these in just a second. So, like I said, we'll go through a few different tips, and these first couple are really going to deal with change management in some ways, and specifically helping staff feel less stressed as things are changing. We hear this from a lot of teams that this is one cause of that whole sprinting a marathon feel. There's also one cause of just like ongoing low to high level stress every day, right? That you think something's going to be different every day when you show up at the office. So it's important that if we are implementing some changes at the organization, that we help scope that for staff. And what I mean by that is that if we're adding a new program to the workload, right? If we're adjusting our fundraising strategy, if we're making a new budget, that's going to cause some line items to shift, and the things we typically have at the office to shift. Not everything's changing, right? It is very rare, possibly never, that an organization is changing 100% of what they do all at the same exact time, right? They're probably not changing their brand as well as their program, as well as their fundraising strategy, financial and operation structures, et cetera, simultaneously. So it's important to walk staff through what is changing and what isn't changing, right? What's known, what's unknown, what are our clear next steps. So an example of this, right, when it comes to kind of the what's known bucket, right, we want to make sure it's clear to the team, here's the things that aren't changing, right? We're adding a new program, but the old one's not going away. Or we're doing this new fundraising strategy, but we still are going to be working with our long-term loyal donors, right? Making sure that they feel like the team and the organization is safe, and that the majority of things are staying consistent, with some things changing. Be honest about the unknown, right? So especially this is really important if we're doing something hard or we're doing something new, right? If we're going to try this aggressive programmatic expansion strategy that we've never done before, we can't know everything that's going to happen with it. I can't guarantee to my staff that everything is going to work perfectly. On this day, we're going to have this many new clients. On this day, we're going to have this many new clients. So it's important we're honest about that and hear what they're concerned by. Sometimes it's helpful for us to know, because it might be things that we need to be concerned by and haven't thought of. Other times, just by voicing it right, they're going to be less stressed by it because they know other people know about it now. So make sure that we're both honest about those unknowns, but also hear their opinion on those unknowns. And then finally, want to give us some really clear next steps, right? If we just announce this big organizational change, or if we just announce yet another kind of small initiative that we're doing, it's really important that at the same time we're talking about, and here's a couple things that are going to happen this week, right, or happen in the next couple weeks. You're going to be getting email from me in a couple weeks talking about X, Y, or Z. It's important that we do that, right, so they feel like there's some action to it, some direction. It feels realer that way. Again, going to be less stressed by that. The second tip here, this again, it's a little bit to the change management, but also just to the culture of the work these days, is that there's a lot of uncertainty in community work right now, right? So regardless of the social issue your nonprofit works on, there's uncertainty in the funding landscape, right? As donors shift, as foundations kind of stay steady, but some are changing what they fund, as government's pulling back. There's a lot of uncertainty in funding and the community needs that we're addressing. and the way that we're addressing those, and how our organizational culture shows up in the community. So it's important that we're honest about that uncertainty with the team, and try to help them kind of walk through that in a way that's a little less stressful. Otherwise, we see this uncertainty is usually the biggest driver of stress when it comes to kind of a changing environment. So what are some of the big questions, right? Helping the team understand, right? Yes, there's a lot of things we may not know, but there's also a lot of things we do know. So what's our priority over the next year, right? Amidst all these changes, what do we want to get done over this next year? How does your individual work, right, in a one-on-one conversation with them, how's your individual work tied to those strategic goals, right? So they understand kind of how they fit into the organizational work plan. How can staff get help if they need it, right? Hey, you and this person are working on this, feel free to work together, right? If you have any questions, come to me, whatever that is, wanting to know what that support structure looks like. We want to try to have, depending on our type of work and size of team, a weekly to bi-weekly team meeting, even if short. If we have a larger staff, so larger than 20, we might be doing this more on a kind of monthly, 6 weeks basis. But smaller groups of that team should be meeting on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, if that's the case. Uh, want to make sure that we're also that every staff member of the organization is having a check-in with someone on a weekly basis. That's the goal. If we're not doing that at all right now, it might take a while to implement. Maybe we start with just kind of every other week or monthly. But the goal is that we get to a one-on-one check-in with all staff. These will be short. These should not be kind of deep dives into performance on a regular basis. These are just to see how things are going, and to be able to offer support there and be able to surface what's working and what's not. And then we want to make sure that ideally this conversation around uncertainty, around the fact that things are going to be okay, around kind of the big questions we have, the priorities we have, are not just coming from the executive director, right? If the ED is the only one telling the staff, and for that matter, the board, that these are the things we're focused on, these are the things we don't know, these are the things we're concerned about, we're missing an opportunity to use other leaders of the organization to really drive that home to staff. So the board can be helpful with this, right? Other senior leaders at the organization will be helpful with this. But it's important that we have multiple people kind of talking about this. So it's not just kind of one person running the show there. How to think through some of those changes you might be implementing. Again, when we think about that 56% of executive directors that are burned out, I can guarantee you that one cause for that is feeling like they have a million different things to do at once, especially things that are changes, right? So either new things or doing current things differently, reevaluating something that they're currently doing. So how do we choose, right? Most of the things we're considering are probably important. They probably have some type of impact on the organization, probably have some type of impact on the community. How do we pick between these? So we recommend using this kind of grid. It's really comparing impact and effort, right? So how hard is it going to be to do for the staff to implement, and how big of a difference is it going to make for the organization or the community? Those things that are high impact and low effort, we just got to make time for. These are easy wins, right? These are important to find. We cannot only do hard stuff all the time. So finding some easy wins to sprinkle in there to get the team excited to see some progress is really critical, especially for the middle of some bigger change projects. If it's low impact and low effort, these are filler items. These are things we're probably going to skip in most cases. But again, the team may sometimes need a little bit of change of pace, right? Something easy, an easy thing to knock out, right? We're going to redo our digital organizational file system, right? Or something that's hard, just takes a little time. Doesn't have a ton of impact, but does help. Those activities can be great to kind of slow the pace of work for a little period of time if needed. Rainy day buckets, right? These are things that are really hard but have low impact. We're going to skip these, right, in most cases, unless we need to do it, right? So sometimes those rainy day projects are something like redoing our digital file system. So we don't necessarily want to do something that's going to take a lot of staff time, possibly not make a big difference, but we know it's critical to our data security, right? Or it's critical to our efficiency long term. So those activities we're going to avoid, and we want to give it a longer time horizon so it doesn't feel unnecessarily urgent. And then finally, there's the strategic bucket of items, right? These are things that are going to be hard to do, but make a really big difference on the community or organization. So these, depending on the size of our team, 1 to 2 of these at a time at most, and should be the major focus. Folks should be able to know that that's what you're prioritizing. So shifting gears a little bit from how we manage the change that's happening, that's impacting the flow of work, the staff's ability to see their impact rate, a couple of those other causes of burnout we talked about. It's talking about how we talk to staff about their performance, right? So this is a big impact on their sense of burnout and their sense of engagement. To know that someone cares, right, about how their work is going, that again, that their work is seen, as we talked about, as one of the causes of burnout, and that there's opportunities for growth, which is one of the causes for engagement. So when we're looking at this, we're thinking about how do we avoid performance conversations being a one-way conversation, right? So it shouldn't just be me telling the manager, hey, here's the things you're doing great, here's things you're doing bad, here's things you're doing different, great, I'll talk to you next year, right? We want this to be a back and forth conversation. So for staff, right, we want them to usually kick off the process by ahead of the meeting, giving us their views on their performance, work towards goals, etc. We want to give them some questions to answer before we actually meet with them. For us, right, as a manager, we want to prepare our thoughts on their performance. Uh, we might get feedback from their colleagues depending on the size of the organization. And we want to prepare a response to their response before we meet. And finally, when we actually sit down and have a performance conversation 1 to 2 times a year, we want to really focus on where's the difference in opinion, right? We'll obviously talk about the things that are going well and things that could be going better and development opportunities. But what's really interesting, what's really important is that we're on the same page, right? We both know this is going well, this is going better, this is the area of focus moving forward. So it's important that we're reviewing those differences. If they scored themselves a 5 out of 5 on communication, we put a 2. That's an important area to talk about, right? And understand why expectations or understanding of current performance differ. But when we have the performance review system, and I kind of hate that terminology around performance management or performance review, because it's so much more than just their performance, right? That we should be talking about here. So we're also talking about, for instance, did they hit their goals, right? And if we don't have goals, we'll talk about setting those in just a second. That's one way we see that we can not get rid of, but limit burnout and disengagement at the organization is by having really strong goals. But they do have goals. Want to talk to them about it, right? If we set a goal and never reference it, it's way worse than never setting a goal in the first place, because now people think the goals don't matter. So it's really important that if we have goals for our staff, we're talking about those at least once or twice a year, and then also regularly checking it in the meantime. So we're going to have a conversation with them about their goals during this. We're going to have a conversation about how do the organizational values that we have show up in their work, right? There's a lot of different ways that they can probably get the same thing done, right? They could do it collaboratively, or they could do it solo, right? They could do it creatively, or they could do it by the book. So if we have some standard organizational values that we want to show up routinely in people's work, we want to be evaluating, right? Are those values showing up in how they're doing their work? And then finally, for any of us that have multiple staff, uh, they're not doing their work in a vacuum, right? They're part of a team. So how are they showing up for their colleagues? How are they engaging with their colleagues? How are they working with their peers? When we think about the goals we're setting with staff, we want it to be a joint process. I don't want to just say, hey, here's your 5 goals for next year, right? Here's your 2 goals for next year. I want to hear from them, right, what they're interested in. I want to share with them what organizationally we need some goals to be, and then come together with the kind of 2 to 4 main goals we want them working on. And that's going to be a mix of kind of professional development for themselves, performance for themselves, and also outcomes for the organization. What do you think about how we can set more of these goals to be process oriented than outcome oriented? The example we always give of this is the fundraising space, right? We know many of our partners don't necessarily set performance goals for their development staff around the dollars raised, but around the outreach and research, et cetera, that they're doing, right? They can't necessarily make those donors hand over a certain amount of money, but they can do it. They can reach out to a certain number of donors, right? They control how many donors they communicate to. They control how much prospect research they do. They control the quality of their writing that they're putting out in the fundraising deal. So having more performance goals tied to what they can control than necessarily the outcome. And then finally, we want to make sure the goals we're setting for staff are realistic. And actually, more often than not, what we see happens in the nonprofit space is that staff care so much about their work that they're the ones offering up unrealistic goals, right? So sometimes it is the manager or board setting an unrealistic expectation for staff, and we definitely want to stop that practice. But we also see more often than you would in the for-profit space that staff themselves, especially junior staff, are so excited by the work that they're doing that they set some pretty aggressive growth goals that may not be realistic, right? So we definitely want to make sure goals are exciting to people, but also that they can get done sustainably. I previewed this a little bit on the previous slide, right? But goals can differ, right? They should. So it's not all performance based. So we might have some goals around the actual work, right? The progress we're making, process or outcome based, right? On what our job is getting done. We should have some goals on the skills that we're kind of developing, right? So some professional development goals for the staff member. And then finally, related to that a little bit, some experiential goals, right? So, hey, I want you to lead X, Y, or Z meeting this year for the first time. I want you to do some public speaking. I want you to take over this project or that project, right? And giving them some experiences of different roles that they may not have had before. And then, as we also mentioned earlier, we want to make sure these conversations with staff are not just once or twice a year. And this is another one of those causes of burnout that relates to some of the ones we shared. And it gets back to people being seen, is that the work happens every day. And if we're only talking about the performance and the management of that performance once or twice a year, it doesn't really feel very genuine, right? So we want to make sure that, while not like every week, and not that we're micromanaging, but on a regular basis, staff know we're thinking about the goals they have, we're wondering how they're doing against them, and we're asking about how we can help, right? The takeaway and the focus of these regular check-ins on performance on goals should not be, hey, it's been 6 weeks, what have you got done? But should be more of a, hey, how are things going? How can I, as manager, facilitate more success for you? Right? What else do you need? And reframing that to make sure they understand that. Really important that they're not getting stressed by these kind of regular check-ins. And then finally, if some of those strategies aren't effective, right, we have some team members or some individual staff that are moving towards or in that kind of burnout disengagement phase. What can we do about it, right? Again, this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a couple initial thoughts here and tips that we've seen partners use effectively with their teams. The first is, how can we remove some pain points, right? So these can be really, really small things, right? Their home office has a really uncomfortable chair, right? Or again, how we access our digital files is super annoying, right? Our email requires 2 logins, so it takes too long in the mornings, whatever it might be. But usually really small things. None of those is the reason why the person's burnt out. But as we can remove those, right? As we can fix those pain points. One organization was telling us how they did this was they were talking to staff, and one of the staff mentioned that there were no napkins in the office, and that they were always annoyed by that. So the next day, package of napkins, right, sitting there for staff to use. Not a big reason that person was probably feeling disengaged overall in their job was the lack of napkins. But by touching and kind of removing those kind of small barriers and small pain points, folks see progress. They understand change is possible, right? They understand things are getting better. So it has a psychological benefit there that makes people feel safer, makes people feel seen, it makes them more likely to kind of re-engage in the work, be able to re-engage in the work. So thinking about it again, could be big picture pain points, could be a little picture, but either way, taking some of those away is going to be helpful. Secondly, some tangible benefits, right? Sometimes it's, again, how people are seen is not just the conversations we have, but actually how we show up with bonuses and salary, right? So, are there tangible financial ways, time off that we can give, um, community gatherings we can do with staff to let them know that we're there to support them, to let them know that we see them, we value them, etc. These rarely are going to move the needle on its own, but they can help, right? And they don't necessarily have to be expensive, but making small progress here is really important. I want to say too quickly as we're getting ready to wrap up here in just a second. Uh, However long you're kind of in that disengagement burnout period for, it usually takes about 1.5 times as long to get out of it, right? So if I'm really feeling burnt out for a month, it's going to take me a good couple months to really be fully re-engaged at work again. So it's important that both staff understand that. Sometimes we see, especially high performers that burn out as they're coming back as they want to re-engage. They're frustrated with themselves. They can't just turn the switch back on. Uh, but that makes sense, right? That's kind of psychologically proven. That's going to take that kind of 1.5 times. It's important for us too to understand as managers that even if things are getting better, they're not going to be fixed overnight. And understand that that's a process to get there to burnout and disengagement. It's also a process to get out of burnout and disengagement. And then finally, motivationally, right? So trying to connect them with the impact of the work, the reason why they're there in the first place, the things they care about when it comes to the work. And as these kind of conversations are kind of evolving, hopefully getting them kind of re-engaged, right, with that kind of core critical kind of mission impact there. So with that, we're going to go ahead and pause. Hopefully there were some helpful tips there as you're thinking about both change management, performance conversations, and what to do when staff are feeling kind of disengaged or burnt out. We'll dive into this topic more in other sessions today. But thank you all for joining. We'll see you on another session soon. Have a good one.